I welcome you on behalf of President Mr. Ajay Gajaria, Secretary Gyanindra ji Mishra, and all other executive members for this today's talk, VAK the Talk, an international panel discussion on refugee, a universal challenge. Under this, we have arranged many episodes on this subject, and today is the first episode on history of refugee, its universality and causes. So we will start today's program with invoking the grace of Lord. I invite Srimati Vrunda Joshi to recite the Saraswati Vandana. Srimati Vrunda Joshi.
नमस्कार, मी वृंदा जोशी. सरस्वती वंदना से हम लोग शुरू करते हैं. या कुंदे मृतुषार हार धवला, या शुभ्रवस्त्रामृता, या वीणा वरदंड मंडित करा, या श्वेत पद्मासना, या ब्रह्माच्युत शंकर प्रभृतिभिर् देवै सदा वंदिता, सा मां पातु सरस्वती भगवती निशेषजाढ्याप्यः. नमस्कार.
Thank you, Vrunda ji. VAK is a registered non-profit, non-governmental organization with an objective to provide a platform to express India-centric view on international events. India, being a knowledge-based society, always believe in the Vedic Suktaha, Ano Bhadraha Krutvo Yantu Vishwataha, meaning, let the noble thoughts come to us from all sides. VAK also serves a platform for understanding various cultures and traditions around the world through studies and seminars with a sole objective of attaining world peace. We are fortunate today to have with us Dr. Shakti Prasad Srichandan, Assistant Professor, Center of European Studies in School of International Studies of Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, who has kindly consented to moderate all the episodes under the topic of refugee, a universal challenge. Dr. Shakti Prasad Srichandan has a vast experience in this field, including national security. We welcome Shakti Prasad ji. As a first guest speaker on today's topic, I welcome Honorable Kobbi Shoshani, Counsellor General of Israel, Mumbai. Dr. Kobbi Shoshani is a graduate of International Relations and Latin American Studies. He served in Embassy of Israel in Belgium, Sweden, Japan, and Thailand. Welcome, Honorable Kobbi Shoshani. As a second guest speaker on today's topic, I welcome Mr. Aditya Satsangi, a Hindu American, an eminent writer and entrepreneur. He has written many books on international policies and Indology. Few of them are Satology, Debunking Mythology, Making of a Statesman, another one, One Arrow, One Kill, and a Samrat Yudhishthir. He is working on the plight of Native Americans who became refugees in their own land. Welcome, Mr. Aditya Satsangi. I once again welcome our audience who have joined us through Facebook and the Zoom link. Without taking much of your time, now I welcome Dr. Shakti Prasad Srichandan and hand over today's proceeding to him to introduce the subject and moderate the event. We all know today's subject is History of Refugee, its universality and causes. Over to Dr. Shakti Srichandan.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Prabhakar ji, for inviting us to this panel discussion. First of all, good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to participate in the panel discussion on VAK the Talk, Refugee, a Universal Challenge, and moderate this particular session on history of refugees, compelled migration, its universality and causes. Maybe migration as an issue. We all know that migration is an universal phenomena that has occurred in all nations at all times and is being repeated throughout history. But a distinction needs to be made. All refugees are migrants, but all migrants are not refugees. Refugees, internally displaced person, asylum seeker, and illegal migrants are not synonymous. And the distinction is crucial since it results in different legal treatment as well as recognition of different rights. So who is a refugee? A refugee is someone who had to flee from his or her own country of origin due to well-founded fear of being persecuted on certain grounds like race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or possessing a particular political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to seek protection from the state of origin. So refugee is a different kind of persona in the overall debate. So becoming refugee is a complex psychosocial process with significant effects and consequences on identity of individuals. Their problem is international in character because the phenomena involves the movement across international borders and it cannot be solved without international cooperation. A number of historical forces and processes have influenced trends and patterns of refugees. It differed from one time to the other. Religious or political persecution, colonization, wars of independence, proxy Cold War conflicts, state collapse, state failure, globalization, the end of the Cold War, and the so-called resurgence of identity politics have all had an impact on the movement of refugees. But how much do you study or conduct research? Our understanding of refugee issues remains incomplete because of arrival of new dynamics and new variables every time we study. While displacement due to religious persecution, civil war, state failure, etc. are established issues, we now see climate-induced refugees also, though it has not been recognized as per international law till now. So our understanding on refugees issues is still evolving. Therefore, it is necessary to deliberate and conduct research for better understanding of the different nuances of the refugee issues. But unfortunately, in India, we don't have many refugee study research institutes or dedicated experts to develop and disseminate understanding of refugee issues. It is in this context, the initiative of the Vishwa Adhyan Kendra Center for International Studies is a step in the right direction. With proposed 6 chapters, Vishwa Adhyan Kendra is going to cover various aspects of refugee issues, this session being the first of those, the inaugural session. With this, may I now invite our learned panelists to address this session. Before you start, I need to inform you that this session is structured in two parts. In the first part, each of our esteemed panelists may take up to 20 minutes to share their ideas and views. At the end of 20 minutes, I will give a gentle reminder. In the second part, we'll have a question and answer session. So now, may I invite our first speaker, Honorable Mr. Kobbi Shoshani, who is the Consul General of Israel at Mumbai, to address us. This virtual floor is all yours, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sakti. I have to say that it's a very sensitive issue. It's a very sensitive issue, not because of the state of Israel. It's a very sensitive issue because it's the Jewish people. And let me, with your permission, of course, speak about the history about the Jewish people and the connection. The Israeli people, the Jewish people, were slaves in Egypt more than 4,000 years ago. And we left Israel as, let's say, slaves runners, or let's to make it in another nice way, as refugees. And we were in the desert for 40 years, and we entered to the state of Israel. It was around 2,800 years ago. Then first of all, my first historical background about being a refugee. Then the connection between the Jewish people to being far away or to run away from the country, your homeland, it's something that is very familiar to us. Then it's a very sensitive issue for us as a Jewish people, and especially as an Israeli, and I will mention it afterwards in the history. That's the first point. The second point, which is, I think, not less important, the state of Israel that was born, we are younger than India in 9 months. We were born as a state in May 1948. You were born in August 1947. And there is a lot of elements in the Indian history which is combined with the Israeli history concerning this issue. There is a lot of similarities, but I will like
एक सेकंड मैं दूसरे मोबाइल से कनेक्ट कर रहा हूँ, एक सेकंड.
I would like to mention one important similarity. First of all, there is a lot of Indian refugees that fled from Pakistan in 1947. I tell you that I met some of them, not a lot, but some of them. Amazing story. They came, they ran away after 1947 to India. Partially they were Sindhi, partially others, and I met some of them, and the stories that I've heard reminds me stories from Israel. Without anything, with a very limited parcels, they went without money, living in a very poor quarters, and like the Jewish people that actually ran away from Arab states and from Europe, especially after the Second World War and even before, the stories are the same, but they came without nothing. And what I saw today in India, which make me a little bit surprised and a little bit, no, I was not surprised, I have to say, a little bit astonished to see that these people took the future in their hands, and they did the right thing for themselves, built up a family, built up a business, tried from scratch to build themselves. And that was a fantastic story and fantastic history of the Indian people who actually fled from Pakistan. And the same thing in Israel. If you see the people who actually run from Europe or run from the Arab countries and to immigrate to the emerging state of Israel, it was the same stories. And my ear heard the same sound from these people in India and the same sounds Jewish people who fled from all over the world and came to Israel. I will not. I will give afterwards to the panel because I have a lot of issues to speak about this issue. But I have to just mention one thing about myself. I was born in Israel. My father was born in Israel, and my grandmothers from both sides. My parents were born in Israel, my mother and my father, and my grandfathers from both sides were born in Israel. Then we are not refugees in my family. But this is very rare because most of the Israelis, their parents definitely, or their, especially in my age, or grandfathers and mothers came from out of Israel. I'm a little bit unique because Israel is a country of immigrants. But my grandfathers and mothers, they came to Israel because of Zionism. Of course, they didn't want to live. Some of them, my sources of my family came from Iraq, and from the other side is from Iran, which I have a very connection by tradition, by food, by everything to these countries, and of course by praying in the synagogues and things like that. But they came without nothing. They ran away, left their homes. My grandfather and mothers came because of Zionism, and they came to Israel. You can say as refugees, some say with ideological backgrounds, which is okay. But right now I'm here as an Israeli diplomat, completely Israel by pure. I don't speak Arabic, I don't speak Iranian, I don't speak Persian, I don't speak, only my skin, which is a little bit, reminds me that this is the source of my family, is actually, we are completely Israelis and settled down completely in Israel as one unity. Now I leave my short introduction, historical and Israeli background to the next stage, and I will give the floor, I think, to the other speaker.
Okay, thank you, sir. Maybe there are a few questions if you like to just answer. There is a question from public. Is it binding on the countries to give shelter to refugees? Your take on this issue?
It's a very good question, and it's a very hard question. And I try to make it simple as much as I can. Let's face right now. I spoke about history, and right now I would like to speak about today's time. Don't forget that this convention, United Nations Convention, that Israel is part of it, was made right after the Second World War. The world was completely different. And right now we are facing two elements which is connected to each other, but I think that we cannot forget them. One is the COVID, and the second thing is the security elements, and both of them brings a lot of elements to these refugees. And I have to say that the convention is extremely important. It's extremely important for us as a human being, as a Jewish people, as an Israeli, to find out, to give a place, a good place, to people who are running like we run from Europe and from Arab worlds to Israel. And this is part of our obligations. But we don't have to forget. The idea of the COVID will bring a lot of transformation and economic problem all over the world. In Israel, in India, in Europe, which the strongest the country will not affect from the COVID, but some countries will affect from the COVID. In the next years, you will see a completely change in the society. And people will try to immigrate and to run away from there because of economy, not because of refugees, which we have to face with them. The numbers is important. Israel is a 10 million people state. It's less than Mumbai as a city It's a little bit, all Israel is a little bit bigger than Pune. Definitely smaller, all Israel, the New Delhi, and of course, Calcutta. Then to open the skies and to say, okay, everybody know, listen, let's be practical. Let's be not naive. We cannot do to solve the world refugees problem. That's the first point. The first point. The second point, which is even harder, is to find out who is a real refugee. And this is a big question. Everybody I tell you, I work at the Minister of Foreign Affairs. All the people who don't want to leave Israel, they want to be a refugee. Why? Because, of course, in Israel, it's much better to live rather than in their countries. Then everybody become refugees. Everybody's gays that actually in their country they will not get them to live. They have a religious problem. There is political issues, and they would like to be refugees. But in order to find out who is really a refugee is not an easy task, and it's not a short task. And we have to remember that the numbers extremely important. Am I answer your question, Dr. Sakti?
Yes. There are a couple of other questions as well. One more question is, do we need an amendment to Geneva Convention on Refugees?
It's a very hard question, and it's a good question, I have to say. I think personally, the answer is yes, but it's not in our jurisdiction. It's a jurisdiction of all states under the United Nations jurisdiction, because of the COVID, because of the economy all over the world, because of the dozens of, we are right now not living after a big war, fortunately, yes, after the Second World War that changed the world. We are not living in a world like what's happened in India in 1947, that the country was split, like in Israel, the country was split, and people move from side to side. Then I think such amendment has to be, but with a smart way. With a smart way, not to leave the real people who need to be a refugee the possibility to be a refugee. The quotas has to be changed. The system of checking them has to be changed. The countries, agreement with all over the countries has to be changed. It has to be split an international agreement for a new convention like that. I think if you ask me, the answer is yes, but it's not under the jurisdiction of the State of Israel, definitely not in my jurisdiction. This is a question of the leaders of the world. And there is, let's not be naive. It's not an easy question. It's not an easy question. There is a lot of implementation for that. And especially to a small country, which is a little bit more richer than the others, like Israel, but it's a very small, very narrow, with a lot of security elements. We have to find out a new mechanism of work.
Yeah. One more question is how religious persecution plays the role in forced migration. I think you are in a better place to answer this question.
No, I think it's again very good question. But you see what's happening in the world today. You see what's happened. Let's talk about Afghanistan for a second, without entering into the political issue. Women. We look at in Israel about what's going on to the women in Pakistan in a very sad eyes. I read the articles and I read the news and I see the programs in television, and it makes me sad to see what's happened to the women in Afghanistan. It's nothing to do with religion. Maybe yes, maybe no, I don't know. But definitely as a Jewish people who have suffered from a religious, let's say, persecution, I think that we should be aware for that. And this is something that, of course, we would like to look and to dig into it and to help to the people who are suffering from that. I remember as a child, for example, with your permission, it was in the 80s, I think in 1979 or 1980, as a child, I remember that Israel accepted 400 refugees from Vietnam. They were completely Vietnamese. They came to Israel. Everybody, I myself, went to the port. They came by boat from Vietnam after the war, and people applaud to them and give them, and they are still living in Israel with a very nice community. Nothing to do with religious, but it's after a war. But I have to say that religious is a very dramatic element here. And I gave the sample of Afghanistan. See what's happened, of course, in other countries, especially in the let's say between Christians, Jewish people, and Muslims all over the world. We have to find out the right mechanism to protect them, to give them the possibility to continue their special lives, and of course to give the people who are really suffer a good place to live and a good place to be continue with his belief.
Yeah. One more tricky question, then we'll move over to our next speaker. This question is why migrants from Muslim-dominated countries don't prefer Muslim theological states to migrate, rather prefer Christian majority Europe to migrate.
You don't give me a hard day today, but I'll try to do it. Let's make it in a short answer and with the long one. The short one, why you ask me? You have to ask them. The longer one is, listen, eventually, in the end of the day, when you are an immigrant, you are looking for a better life. When you're a refugee, you want to improve your life. And this is exactly the point that I would like to mention about India. Eventually, in the end of the day, when you live under democracy, you live in a better life. And it doesn't matter if you are Muslim, if you are Jewish, if you are Christian, to live under democracy with a lot of difficulties. It's better life. You have your right to say, you have a right to read the newspaper in a proper way. You have to right to be under court, in okay position. I don't want to expect you to be a criminal, but when you are in court, the court has to be straight. And this is what's happened in a democracy. And people eventually, at the end of the day, they would like to go to a place that their life is going to be better. And I think that the best way to live is to live. Doesn't matter if it's India, Israel, United States, Canada, Sweden, Japan. You would like to live under a place of democratic countries. This is my answer. But the real answer, you have to ask them. Why? Why you are going there? Then eventually the system, and it's nothing to do with the religion. The system, the democratic system, is better for everybody.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, sir. And we'll come back with more questions. I can see many questions in the chat box, and we have already received so many questions. But before that, we now move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Aditya Satsangi. He's, as already introduced by Prabhakarji, he's a reputed author, and he's also associated with a number of organizations here in US. Now over to you, Aditya Satsangi.
Namaste, and thank you all for inviting me, and thank you, Dr. Shakti Prasad Srichandan and Gyanindra Kumar R.S. Mishra, and Honorable Consul General Kobbi, Mr. Kobbi from Israel, His Excellency. So thank you all for joining. I know some faces here on the discussion here. So thank you all, Dr. Anil Vartak ji and also Sanjay Jha ji. I know some of them here. So before I start off, and I heard Honorable Consul General very attentively, and being a diplomat, he has his own boundaries. So he's representing Israel. So if you look at the 1951 Convention on UNHCR, which followed from 1914, World War I, and the League of Nations started the first definition of what is a refugee. So you'll see the history of refugee as someone who is thrown out due to mainly because of World Wars I and II. But the United Nations, as we know today, HCR, has not captured the refugees which were made in their own countries before the world wars. The process started in the 6th century. And the 6th century was the beginning. And believe me, I would like to put a disclaimer. I have an author's liberty. And the author's liberty means that I can speak freely as per the Constitution of the United States as well as Constitution of India. So my last book came out, Gold, Glory, and God, in which I highlighted what happened since the 6th century. Now, in the 6th century, the first faith-based wars started when the papal bulls were issued. Papal bulls, some of you may not know. Papal bulls is a decree by the Roman Catholic Church to ask the Christians to conquer other territories. Now, further papal bulls were issued in the 13th century. Most of the people are not even aware of that. In the 13th century, when Europe was fighting diseases and all kinds of I would say tribal wars. Roma, there were many tribes over there. Germano tribes, Franco tribes, Gauls. Then the English were there across the island, across the Europe. And if you look at the history from between 6th century and 13th century, this was a serious period of expansion. The Christians, which were a new faith and mostly centered around Eastern Europe, they're fighting in the probably popularly known as Byzantine, according to Wikipedia. And I don't believe in Wikipedia sources too much because most of the Wikipedia is a propaganda sometimes nowadays in history perspective. And they're fighting with the Ottoman empires. And Ottoman empires, we all know that the Indian forces freed Jerusalem and Haifa during the World War I from the Ottoman Empire. The British used Indian soldiers, which Indian Foreign Minister Jai Shankar honored them today during his visit to Israel recently. And World War II also, the same thing happened over there. But we'll go back very early stage, 6th century to 13th century wars, and the 15th century papal bulls. Now, 15th century papal bulls, which are issued by Pope twice, where they divided the world, where they gave the Spanish and the Portuguese forces the east coast and the west coast of United States. And that's how the Columbus journey begins, which is sanctioned religiously by the Pope. And that's how the Spanish, I usually refer to them as Spaniards. Columbus was an Italian explorer, was sent to discover India. So in my book, I mentioned that I mentioned over there that Indian is telling the tale of other Indians, because everyone got the name Indian because of India, East India, which was a major trade post for the rest of the world in terms of share of world trade. It is very surprising to note that India at that time did not have the expeditionary armies. That means that the armies which will go to other lands to conquer them. India was largely just a trading point because of the goods they had, spices, and also naval know-how. They knew how to make good ships. And this was a major trade. So when people say just spices, no, not just spices. Rest, everything was coming from India: astronomy and spices, obviously, manufactured goods, quality clothes, and also the arts. They were the major exports from India, other than processed gems and jewelry, which even happens today. So some of the trade of India has not changed much from the 6th century. So the conquest was gold, glory, and God. That was this is three phrases for which the colonization was initiated. If you look at the history of North Africa, when the Islam attacked them in the 7th century from the Middle East, crossed over to Egypt, the biggest brunt of that attack was borne by the Jews, because Jews were mostly living near River Nile. And most of the Moses story comes from that area. And before the Jews was, that area was inhabited by the Romans, and before Romans, Alexandria port was built by Greeks in the north of the river, at the source of River Nile. And you can see, even today you can see Alexandria, which was a Greek city, then became Roman city. And then if you look at further the migration, the Berbers of Algeria were known as Berbers, even in the Vedic literature, Mahabharata also, because I'm a student of Mahabharata. So the pattern of removal of the natives, and this is what my point is, that the natives are the people who have retained their faith and who have not converted. And that credit must go to the Jewish community also, because they did not convert to these invading faiths. But if you look at the refugees which were created because of these invasions, which were done for gold, glory, and God, and this reflects a certain pattern. Within first century, after the first invasion started of the North Africa, by the 7th century, the entire Saharan Africa became an Islamic nation because of the wars. And it also, by the 13th century, all of them reached Spain. Then that's where the Moors started, invasion started. Umayyad dynasty started there. So the world has seen a lot of refugees being created from the 6th century onwards. They recognized in the First World War, because First World War was the first European large-scale war, and this convention was created mostly for the Europeans. It did not take into account other aspects of colonial excesses which created refugees also. I'll give you another example coming to the Southeast. And there's a lot to say, but I've written in my book, so I cannot cover because of the time limit we have. But if you look at Philippines, that in 15th century, Philippines was a Hindu country completely, speaking Tagalog. Tagalog is still their language, and Tagalog is written in Brahmi script, which is a derivative of Devanagari script. And even today, the words are very much like Hindu. The entire Malaya, Indonesia, Malaysia, and all these regions were a Hindu, very much a Hindu countries. Now the attacks, the Spaniards, when they reached Philippines in 1521, between 1521 and 1621, there was a decree passed by the Pope from Vatican that either you convert or leave the land for Filipinos. And within 100 years, it was a completely 100% Catholic country. So wherever Spaniards went, they introduced Christianity as a means of conquest. So if you look at the Philippines history in Southeast Asia, is the complete history of refugees. And many of those people ran towards Malaysia, Indonesia, and some of them did come to Indian Northeast also. This is the history of Philippines. If you look at South America, it's the most tragic story not told ever. The South America, between 1493 to almost 1846, 1846 is when the United States completely took over the Mexico's regions in North USA. If you see, more than 100 million people have been killed. The most of the European riches have come from looting South America. Again, I say gold, glory, and God. It's a very gory story. I've covered in my book, and I titled it A Curse on the Natives. And if you look at, I have not come to India yet. The story is the same, so the pattern was First the Dutch would invade, then the Portuguese would come, then the French would come, and then the Spaniards would come, and finally the British. But all of them shared so the wealth. Ultimately, they all reached Europe. And so when these countries, South American countries and Asian countries, asked repatriation of wealth from Europe, they're perfectly justified, because these countries are poor because the wealth has been taken away in the name of God, in the name of glory, in the name of every other thing. Even today, the colonial rules are still going on, because United Nations has not been able to solve the issues of faith. Actually, the rights of the natives have not been able to resolve it. It is still working on the political grounds. And that's why I claim to have the author's liberty first, before I put the disclaimer there in this talk. If you look at the history of India, India was the biggest challenge. First of all, India was the goal, but India was the biggest challenge also. India in Greek literatures is being identified from the borders of Iraq to Cambodia. This is the Greek definition of India. This is such a large country, I mean, bigger than Russia today. Later on, during the Roman conquests, this area was reduced and brought down to Indonesia, to Afghanistan, which is today's Afghanistan. But generally, Iran was called a Persian country, and Persian country was Zoroastrian. I make a distinction between Zoroastrianism and Persian. Parsi is a Sanskrit word. Parsi is mentioned in Mahabharata also. And I make a distinction between Iran, because the Iran, after the Islamic destruction of Zoroastrianism, it's an occupied land. So the Zoroastrians, when they were persecuted by the invading Arabic armies, which is today's called Iran, and very surprisingly, Iranians call themselves Aryans. Actually, the Arya word is used, which is a Sanskrit word, and which shows that they had a Hindu past. But they were very forcefully converted out on the threat of the sword, and some of them came to India. The Russians came to India, and therefore we have many Parsi places of worship, fire temples in India today left. Even today, the persecution of Zoroastrians in Iran continues. They are the original owners of Iran, and the persecution continues. Their language is not getting, they're refugees in their own lands. They have to practice their religion hiding from the Iranian regimes, because Iranian regimes have become the custodians of Islam, and therefore they are not allowed to practice their own faith. You'll be shocked to know that this persecution continues even today. And even today, the languages, the only place they could run to was India, because that's the place was written in their scriptures, Ahura Mazda, that they are the people of India. Because Parsi from Mahabharata times was Indian territory, and it's a large area. Iraq, Iran, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, these are all considered Parsi territories, up to Armenia. And Turkey was right in the middle, very small nation, and which was in Mahabharata also is mentioned as a region of Berber, and Berber means unregulated tribes generally. Malecha and Yavana, this is the name given to them in Mahabharata. But if you look at the modern history and you look at the history of the refugees, then many of the nations became the natives became refugees in their own lands. And if you think this has ended, this is not ended. If you look at the World War II convention, post-World War II convention, it was a complete destruction. The British just created lines, like using a scale on a piece of paper, and cut nations apart, and created divisions within those nations so that the faith rules. Ultimately, you need to know, America is really struggling with critical race theory. But I completely debunk that. I say critical faith theory is actual reason behind critical race theory. Critical race theory is actually hiding the real intentions, and that was critical faith theory. What happened to natives of North America is a story which we are still struggling with. The country was occupied by the European settlers. Canada was occupied by the European settlers. European settlers colonized Australia, the history of Aborigines show that every part of Australia was occupied by Aborigines. These Aborigines are very similar to Hindus because they came from Malaya Desh, Fiji. They're very similar to, they worship sun, they worship the energy, they worship the nature, elements of nature, which are very similar to Hindu way of life. And the same was the case of Aborigines, Maori tribes in New Zealand. So all these nations, there were severe violent activities were done by these colonial powers, denying them. In fact, in Australia, Aborigines and even in USA, the natives were hunted down by gatherers, were literally the 12 missions of California. I live in California, I live in San Diego, and speaking from San Diego. And so in San Diego, there's a first mission started by Hon.Mr. 21 missions in California. They captured 290,000 Native Americans. They put 95,000 children under the Christian parents so that they can be converted. And most of the people we do not know were used as slaves. And I forgot to mention, when the Arabic forces attacked North Africa, between 13th century and 18th century, Africans were sold as slaves, and it was a very lucrative trade. And the methodology of slave trade was the Europeans would buy slaves from the Muslim rulers of Africa. And that was the slave trade. I will just give you a pointer. A small country of Ghana was sold for 7,000 ducats and 12 slaves. That was the price of the slaves. 12 slaves. The entire country was sold. And so this has happened. The trade of the humanity did not exist in any of these lands, because their idea was that they have a superior faith to anyone else. So that's why the civilizing missions were instituted by the church as well as the Ummah. Ummah is the descendants of the Umayyad dynasty. People think that Ummah is a global conglomerate. No. Umayyad dynasty, from them the word comes Ummah, because he was the best known conqueror of the whole world on behalf of the Islamic regimes. If anyone thinks that these colonization wars have started, they are completely living in denial. The colonization, the United Nations has been used for colonization also. And even though we are trying to civilize it and we are working hard, and I appreciate the efforts of everyone, especially India, because India has put a lot of faith in United Nations, and India has put a lot of faith. Again, the old wisdom of India has come forward. Despite being severely persecuted, India, because of its ancient philosophy, has become the actual protector of rights across the world, including they have always stood by the Jewish people who were hunted from Egypt, Germany, and Europe, and they have given them shelter in India. And also the plight of every other Muslim also, because the Muslim on Muslim has been the worst atrocity, which we all know. And that's why I did not particularly touch, because some things is best left to be unspoken sometimes. If you look at the history of India, 1741, Marthand Varma was the first ruler, any part of the world, which defeated Dutch in a straight fight in Calicut across Kerala. And that was awakening for the European conquerors that you cannot militarily conquer India. And they started the next wave of colonization, which you all know started in the late 1800s or 19th century. In the late 1800s, that started by Max Muller and Macaulay, because there was no way to capture India with arms, because the Cholas, Chalukyas, and also much later than them, the Marthanda Varmas and many other Rajput tribes of North India, which severely resisted Islamic fights. They'd all studied those fights. And very few Indians realize that the Akbar was not a winner. Akbar was a loser. He did not win against Maharana Pratap. A lot of fake news has been spread around. And this fake news started, this is called a military propaganda to make the enemy weak. So if somebody thinks that they just came to trade, no, they did not come to trade. They came to civilize. That means to convert everyone to Christian faith so that they can control the lands. Ultimately, the fight was for the lands and through faith. So if everyone becomes like them, then they have an upper hand. Till date, if you look at the South America, look at the Southeast Asia, particularly Philippines. Philippines is the poorest country in the Southeast Asia. And it has been an American colony, it has been a Spanish colony. Look at any South American country, all are poor. The only reason the few countries could not remain poor were China, India, Israel, Japan. These are the only few countries which are rich. Because these countries...
Aditya, sorry for interruption, but I mean, we had now 20 minutes past. So if you can just wind up within the next 2-3 minutes, we can start the question answer session. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I know as an author, you have so much data in our head here, right here. Okay. So just I would say there are 4 countries of Asia, which have retained the original culture, which is Israel, Japan, India, and China. And to some extent, Russia on the west part, because the eastern part of Russia is occupied territory, which is known as Siberia, which was not Russia before. So these are the only countries rich. So any country which retains their native character becomes rich. And thank you. And I did cover some important pointers given to me by Dr. Gyanindra ji. So I'll stop here. Thank you. Namaste.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Aditya ji. You really covered so many areas. I mean, these are really interesting, but you see the refugee as a concept and as a part of overall discourse, it really takes a long time, and we don't have so much time. But you tried your best to cover as many aspects, nuances possible in such a short period of time. Now we'll have a question answer session, but before the house is open, I have some specific questions for you. We have already received these questions for Aditya ji. So the first question is why majority of the refugees, forced migrants are from Muslim dominated countries? You can use your author's liberty to answer this question.
Yes. Fire all the guns on the author. Fire all the guns on the author. Yeah. So this is a very classical case of neo-colonization. Most of the Muslim countries come to the United States. They run away from their religion, and they come to the United States to practice their own religion. So why they're not allowed to practice in their own countries? So the point is, it is also known as Stockholm Syndrome. And they have been, the entire society is drilled into their heads that anything other than their own religion is all kufar or kafir. And so when they come to the United States, also they want to practice their own religion. That's what the Americans ask them, that why did you come away from your own country where you're practicing already religion? And there also is a joke that if Sharia is implemented on everybody, on all Muslims exclusively, that within 24 hours, there'll be no Muslim left, because they ran away from Sharia in the first place. And so they want to again acquire the same thing. But in a democratic country, like His Excellency Kobbi said, that in a democratic country is the only way to practice freely and economically prosper. So they come to these democratic countries to earn wealth, and then they go back to send the wealth to the same place where they come from. So it's a very, this kind of refugee movement or asylum seeking is seen to be more political in nature, to demographically alter the other societies. Israel is suffering from the same problem what India is suffering. India is suffering a lot of problem in the border states with Pakistan and Bangladesh, and also the United Arab Emirates inspired Kerala. So it's the same problem which we are suffering, where it's again the conquest of gold, glory, and God. It's the same thing. Ultimately, the God is the main thing, but rest everything is secondary. But ultimately, in the end, if you look at it, it's all Artha Sanchayan. That means to snatch the wealth of the places where they go to.
Yeah, thank you. And next question is how you see India's approach to tackle refugee forced migration from other countries?
Every country has the right to refuse refugees. Every country has the right. Like, for example, like the from Burma, the Rohingya Muslims came, Bangladesh refused to accept them. Even though Bangladesh is an Islamic country, they refused to accept them. As per the United Nations conventions, every country has the right to refuse it. And India doesn't have that policy because India itself is a highly populated state. So other countries, anyone who wants to accept them, and you have to understand one factor, that the global population is decreasing, not increasing. There are a lot of countries in the world which are depopulated right now, particularly Europe and Africa, to be surprisingly. Africa is a very large landmass, very, very large landmass, and it's 11 million square kilometers. And it's a very big continent. So we have to see how to send them out. So United Nations Convention on Refugees has to be amended because the faith-based demographic conversion strategy must not be encouraged by the United Nations. For India, the refugee crisis is artificial and it is not warranted in a way that because the border states of India, particularly Pakistan and Bangladesh, are totally failed societies. We have just seen Bangladesh riots, which all of us in the US have severely protested against. And that particular extermination of the native population, which was Hindus before, that has created such a big gap in the social fabric of that nation in Bangladesh. In Pakistan, the Hindus have been practically wiped out. And it's just 1.8 million Hindus left in that country out of a country of 220 million people.
Aditya, just to interrupt, actually, the question was little bit. It has some specific connotations. In the sense, I just wanted to. The question was related to how you see India's approach in tackling refugees. I mean, we discussed about other countries' issues, but how you see India's approach? That was the question.
India's approach has always been a benevolence. Yes,
Yeah.
India's approach has always been benevolence. They really followed the United Nations Charter. And India's approach should change actually. India should not accept refugees from countries which may alter the demographic setup. And I already said it's the author's liberty to say something. But India should not accept from countries which may come here for strategic purposes, so that the border states can be converted, so that the border management becomes difficult. India's approach is the ideal member of the United Nations. I can tell you one thing. Is one of the countries where every other country has a trust on, like most of the countries, including the United States, they trust in India's position on various matters in the especially in the UNHCR side. UNHCR is a Geneva-based body. It's not a US-based body, and it is highly, highly controlled by the Islamic lobbies. And India may have to recognize it or de-recognize it, because they have to follow what is best in the interest of India. But so far, India is the ideal member of refugee rights and asylum seekers. India has not refused anyone so far, but they should, ideally.
Yeah. One related questions maybe. The question is, though a land of many religious beliefs, why we don't see religious persecution-led forced migration from India?
So one thing about India is that India, the predominant culture of India is Sanatan Dharma, is a predominant culture. Whether you can be of any faith, India has not persecuted any religion of the world so far. In fact, India is the only country where majority is persecuted by the minority. I even question the majority-minority concept in India also. Because you understand, majority and minority concept in the West is based on the race, not on the basis of faith. So in India, it is applied on the faith, not on the race. Because in India, the race theory doesn't exist. Like I tell to an American that I'm a 100% gold standard Indian, because I know my father, mother, and I know last 20 generations of my father and mother, they are all Indians from Hindu families. So in India, the concept of Western majority minority does not apply. So India needs to, so what happens is, even the concept of left and right from the West gets deformed in India. The left in India is actually the right of the US. Or I don't know what they are. The left in India has no meaning. because it is such a inclusive society. There is no opposition needed. So the opposition is created for issues which are practically, logically not sensible. But if you look at the Indian society as a whole, the persecution has largely been not there, and therefore India is the ideal destination for refugees from Africa. Many Africans, they come to India for education and other things. And if you look at the culture of India, then you all know much better than me that the culture of India has an art of, Hindu culture has an art of assimilating everyone else. But the others will not assimilate. There are Abrahamic faiths like Christians, Islamic, they will not assimilate. The reason is, if they assimilate, then their allegiance to their faith from the Middle East goes away. This is what is taught to them. So the assimilation of on Abrahamic societies with the non-Abrahamic societies in India has been a challenge, but Hindus have managed it pretty well. But it will grow further because the strong identity culture they have on the basis of the Abrahamic faith, which directly conflicts with the Hindu principles, and because ultimately Hindus become minority because of that attack. And then after they become minority, then all the rights which they enjoyed and which they gave in the first place are taken away. So the principles in India have to be very carefully made now, so that we retain the culture of India. As long as India remains Hindu, it will remain as India. Otherwise, India will be like other nations, mostly Balkanized.
Yeah, thank you. Now, opening the house for questions from audience. I can see an armada of questions lined up for both of our panelists. I will go one by one. So first, asking these questions to His Excellency Mr. Mr. Kobbi. The question is from Mangesh. He's asking, how is Israel going to handle the growing population of Islamic citizens within the country? Their loyalties are divided. Lebanon is a living example. You have to unmute.
It's first of all, it's two questions. Israel is a democracy. Is of course the state of the Jewish people because of the history, and we understood that without a homeland for the Jewish people, we cannot survive as a nation. And Israel is built after 1948 as a home and homeland for all Jews all over the world. Right now in Israel, there are average 80% of Jewish people, a little bit less, and around 20% of the Muslim population. We are a democracy. The rights are, like in India, open and free to everybody. But I think that this is the land of the Jewish people, and this is, of course, we accept all other minorities. And I think this is a basic thing. Concerning the Lebanon, which is completely different issue. Right now, what's going in Lebanon, it's quite bothering, and I have to tell you, it's break my heart as well. You know, the economy situation in Lebanon is not good. And if I connect it to the speech of Aditya ji, I think that I'm against, let's say I'm against colonialism. Israel has suffered from a colonial wave before 1948 and even long time before. And of course, India, I'm against colonialism, and this is something which I can understand, and I think it's not a good idea. But the most important thing is and I love very much history. I'm crazy about history, and I think that I not quite know about history. But if you think that you can all the time think about the history and cry about the history and not do something to yourself, it's a big mistake. And I think that in this case, all the countries in the world, doesn't matter if it's in the Middle East, in India, they, especially the people who are actually refugees, and what's happened in Syria a decade ago was also dramatic. You know, I saw the photos. It's not nice to me to see, you know, people under attack. I mean, a citizen under attack. It's not an easy. People fled out of their homes. And I really felt, sorry for them, but not more than sorry for them. It was a lot of help for Israel, although we don't have any relations with Syria. We don't have a diplomatic relation. We are, by law definition, we are under war. But we gave the support to the citizen, because citizen, to be a human being, is the most important thing. If you forget that in front of you is not standing a human being, is a big mistake. Humanity is important, but you don't have to be naive, I have to say.
Yeah. One more question is from Ajay ji. His question is whether Jews got more respect in the world after emergence of Israel.
Again, sorry for the question.
I'm repeating, whether Jews got more respect in the world after emergence of Israel.
If I understand correct the question, Israel.
Actually, the question is whether Jews got more respect in the world after emergence of Israel.
I have to say, I know I'm a representative of the state of Israel, and I speak to you in a very free way. Israel has suffered from a bad image in the recent years. If you ask me why, I don't have an answer. Israel brought to the world the drip irrigation, that you use it a lot in India. Israel brought a lot of Nobel laureates, a lot of invention. Even your cellular that you are speaking right now, there is a technology there. You know how many Jewish Israeli brains, including, by the way, Indian brains, I have to say, with this vaccination of the COVID. They brought a lot. We brought philosophy, we brought medical, we brought a lot. And I'm asking myself, why? No, it's a big question. It's a question of religious, it's a question of, sometimes envy. But I have to tell you something, which surprised me in the recent years. I get a lot of messages from such many, in my Facebook, in my Twitter, in my Instagram, people from Iran, people from Iran, Iraq, people from Afghanistan, people that originally, they don't have any connection with us. And you know what is the common words that I've written in these lines? We love you, we admire you, and we'd like peace with you. And this is the answer. And not because I'm right now, because for many, many years, we had suffered, I don't know. But I found out that especially the Muslim in the Arab world understood that we are not the enemy. We are not the enemy. We love people. We don't have something against Muslim people. No, not whatsoever. We don't have any against anybody. We like India. I was here in 1992, right after the establishment of the full diplomatic relations between India and Israel. And I remember I was in New Delhi. Right now I'm in Mumbai. I was sent as a very young diplomat to New Delhi. People look at us in a very strange way. For us, we look to us in a very normal way. And people love India. And I ask myself, why? What did we do? And right now, when I see the love and the respect that Israel get from Indian people all over the state, it doesn't matter if they are Indo or Muslims, my heart becomes full of love again. Because I tell you why? Because we are coming from a good place. And I'm saying that not because I'm a diplomat, because this is the reality. I get the messages from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Iran. Please open the relation. We would like to learn. We would like to do something together. We would like to come to visit you. We would like to see the culture. This is the right way. Treat people as a human being. That's the most important. But don't be naive. If you're my enemy, I have to defend myself. It has to be clear. If you would like to come and make a peace, Ahlan sahlan. Give me a hug, we'll be the best friend.
One more question is there. How can refugees and migrants experience social inclusion and well-being? A case study of Israel.
I have to tell you, in the 80s, there is a big immigration coming from Russia. Russian Jews, 1 million people came from, let's say 10 years, they came to Israel. I remember that in my school, for example, it was young boy came from Russia. It was the beginning of the wave. He came and everybody welcomed him. Of course, he didn't speak even one word in Hebrew. He spoke Russian. He looks Russian. He speaks Russian. He acts as Russian. I tell you why. Tell you something which is very, very interesting. You see the next generation. And I saw this friend that I'm still in contact with him. He's from Russia. He was like a refugee, okay? He was an immigrant. Of course, he come home. Everybody gave him a hug. Everybody laugh about his accent in Hebrew. It's about we were kids. They become the top of the top. And I tell you why. And this is something, sorry that not to sound a little bit modest, yes? Because the Jewish concept said history is important, but don't look back and cry. Look forward and do the best. And this is the best way to work all over the world. Try to do. Sometimes the first generation suffer. The second generation become, the top doctors, the top pilots, the top engineers, the top high-tech. Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, Your Excellency. Now, moving over to our next speaker, Aditya ji, there are so many questions for you. I'll start with a hypothetical question. I consider it. The question is, do you think that it will be a good idea to have some independent islands in the world under the purview of UN, which can be earmarked for settling refugees for a limited time period?
UNHCR has lost its relevance in the world. And I have said it in many articles in many places that India should demand either a change or set up a separate system for asylum and refugees, which helps India. India is a large country, 1.4 billion people, and the world has to recognize India. And United Nations in its current form doesn't help India. So India ultimately has to take a very tough call. First of all, leave the British Commonwealth, which I have already said in many of my articles and my books also. In fact, the first book, I mentioned that India should set up Dharma Commonwealth or Dharma societies, where the Dharmic countries, like the Southeast Asian countries, they should form an alliance and India should set up a separate system.
Sorry for interruption, Aditya. Actually, the question is, a hypothetical question. It says, do you think that it will be a good idea to have some independent islands in the world under the purview of UN?
That's exactly
this question is asked by Mr. Vijay Chore. This is a hypothetical, just to have a separate island for refugees. Your opinion about it?
Separate island for refugees is not practically possible because again you have to set up a separate country. It's not possible. But the larger thing is whether you can do it under UN or not. You cannot. India is like a second grade member, despite having 1.4 billion people. It is still not a permanent member, which is again a colonial legacy.
The next question is from B. Joshi. The question is, refugees are accepted or allowed in country by leaders, but without the consent of residents. However, it affects the lifestyle of residents. Your opinion about it?
So the accepting or rejecting refugees is a right of the Indian government. And the Indian government is an elected representative. So Indian government is very much empowered to make decisions on that area. So once you elect a government and they make a decision, then it is binding on all the citizens of India practically.
One more question is from Mangesh M. The question is whether democracy in India should be modified to guided democracy to deal with and stop the demographic reversals.
India should very clearly, I will agree with His Excellency Kobbi here. India should declare itself as a Hindu nation very clearly, and everyone who comes to India has to respect that culture. Just like in USA, they very proudly say that they're a Judeo-Christian society, very clearly. So the secularism which is sold in India is very faulty. So India has to maintain its identity and practically call themselves a Hindu nation, and everyone is welcome as long as you're a friend of India or Hindus.
One question is from Dr. Amar Bhole. Do refugees add value to the host nation? Is there any study in this regard?
Yes, refugees do add value. We have seen that in the case of Parsi refugees. Most of the Parsi businesses have flourished in India. Tatas and many other countries are there. Many other communities are there. They do add value. In fact, Apple is founded by a Syrian American, and we all know Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs is Syrian and American. So they do add value.
Yeah.
Not all of them.
Yeah. The next question is from Mr. Prabhakar Tijari. His question is, can India make a policy to grant refugee status to only religious minorities of that country from where the refugees are coming? I mean, he's talking about only religious granting refugee status to religious minorities only.
So first of all, in India, the concept of minority majority is very faulty. I said it before. It is not practical. It is not as per the international norms also. Now, the second thing is, or directly answering that question, India should definitely put a course for the refugees that they have to understand Hinduism, or they should accept refugees only from like-minded people. India has the freedom to do that. India can always say they can accept refugees from Thailand, Cambodia, or any other nation, but not from a nation which can alter their demographics.
Yeah. Next question is from Mr. Sunil Misraji. The question is whether the migration of Indian community to countries like Mauritius, Malaysia, Singapore in the 18th and 19th century is a complete process.
Well, Indian migration has happened to East Africa, entire East Africa, Ethiopia, Sudan. If you go to there, Indian migration has happened to Southeast Asia. In fact, like I told you, the Greeks considered from Cambodia to practically the entire Iraq as Hindu country. They considered that. So it was India before, recognized by the world, but its definition has changed by the British imposed boundaries.
Yeah. One question is from Mr. Ajit Panikar. Can Indian Parliament pass a resolution to consider our old name Bharat and a Hindu country, as after 1947 the non-Hindus decided to move out?
Well, Bharat is the name in the passport also, so it's already there, and removing one English word from there doesn't make it. It's not important enough.
I think we are now at the flag end of our session. So I must thank both of our panelists, His Excellency His Excellency Honorable Mr. Kobbi Shoshani and Mr. Aditya Satsangi ji. They covered so many areas. I mean, so within 1.5 hours, we covered so many areas. Aditya Satsangi ji, he covered the historical path the refugee issue has traveled so far, while the technical and legal aspects, and especially how the Jewish people struggled and how they struggled with these refugee issues and how they survived the persecution and all the difficulties they faced over the years. He highlighted those things. And with both Aditya Satsangi's input and His Excellency's inputs, I'm sure our this project of having a comprehensive view about refugee issues will go a long way in enhancing our understanding and understanding of others. With this, I conclude my part of moderating this session. Now I request Mr. Narendra Negandhi ji to offer a vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, namaskar, and really we thank from our heart the kind of the seminar or the kind of lecture that we got the knowledge from. Okay, I am a treasurer of VAK, and we are really truly enlightened by a very the knowledge passing on from the real experts on the field of refugee, which is one of the most critical problem that the world is facing. We are truly enlightened by experts, distinguished guests. Okay, and here we would like to thank Mr. Kobbi Shoshani, the Consular General, His Excellency Consular General. We really, sir, here I would like to say one more sentence is, we love Israel. Okay, we love, right from the beginning, from the young age, from the young age, whenever we have read about Israel, okay, we always used to feel why our country is not becoming friendly to Israel for whatever political reason. But ultimately, we saw the change of course, and we are very happy to be there. Okay. Similarly, when it came from Mr. Aditya Satsangi ji, for the first time, I came to know that Philippines was a Hindu country. Okay, and even the kind of Hindu or the India, what was called Bharat at that point in time. Yes, we knew that we had an expanded boundaries, big boundaries, huge country. Okay, but when covering the whole Southeast Asia was really something new for us. Aditya ji has written so many books. Okay, one of the definitely the Gold, Glory and God. This is my, I can promise you that I'm going to be buying very shortly. Thank you very much for an in-depth knowledge that you have given. Okay, and frankly, not a single program can succeed without the right moderator. And we really thank Dr. Sakti, who has really, given his time, to the extent of really ensuring that this program becomes successful, and subsequently even the data collection that we are planning to from all the 6 series program that we are going to be going. So once again, I would like to thank all 3. There is Mr. Kobbi Shoshani, Aditya Satsangi ji, and Dr. Sakti for a lovely program that we could have. In addition, I would also like to thank a lot of people, all of you, for participating in this program. Okay, Tijare ji, thank you very much for organizing the Saraswati Vandana, and Ms. Joshi, thank you very much for really starting this program in the right spirit. Okay, I thank you all, and we hope to meet you again, once again, maybe after 2 months out of this as a second series of the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please.